We live in a culture that is constantly telling us, if it feels good, do it. Every message we see, whether it's in advertising, entertainment, on social media, reinforces the idea that personal happiness is our ultimate goal. Self-expression is celebrated. Self-control is often seen as unnecessary, even oppressive sometimes. And the world encourages us to follow our hearts, to chase our dreams, to prioritize what makes us feel good in the moment. But deep down, we know that simply indulging in every desire doesn't lead towards lasting fulfillment, does it? Actually, if we follow that path, it can lead us to regret, to broken relationships, to struggles that we never anticipated or expected. And just because something feels right in the moment, it doesn't necessarily lead to what is truly right. So if personal happiness isn't the ultimate goal, then I beg the question this morning, what is? Well, the Bible presents something radically different, a completely different perspective than the one that the culture offers us and often tells us. One that calls us to not faithfulness to ourselves, but faithfulness to God. The world tells us that we should be true to ourselves, to follow our hearts no matter what, but God calls us to stay true to Him even when it is difficult. And that brings us to the key question that we are going to ask and search and find the answer to this morning, which is, how do we remain faithful to God rather than ourselves when we are facing some of life's greatest challenges? And so the way we're going to answer that question this morning is through our passage in Genesis chapter 29, because we're continuing in our series, Overcome, where we've been looking at the story of Joseph, and this is our third week. Last week, we read about Joseph's betrayal by his brothers, and we learned how God often uses the harder path to bring about his greatest plans. And this week, we're picking up the story after Joseph has already been sold into slavery by his brothers. And this morning, as we look at this section of Joseph's life, we're going to find that true success does not come from God, does not come from our own hands, but from God's hand. And we're going to see that success is not a safety net. Oftentimes, it's actually a spotlight that reveals our true character. And then we're going to see that temptation often promises us quick rewards, but no reward compares to what God gives to those who remain faithful to Him. And so our text, like I said, is going to be in Genesis chapter 39, starting at verse 1. If you brought your Bibles, I encourage you to open there and read it with us. If not, it will be available on the screens beside me. But last week, we were in chapter 37, and we got to the end of it. And in the end of chapter 37, Joseph had been sold to some Ishmaelites who are on their way to Egypt. And the story left us on a bit of a cliffhanger in verse 36, when it said, "Meanwhile, Joseph was sold to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard." So we know Joseph's story is not yet over. God's path has led him to Egypt, being sold into servitude under one of Pharaoh's officials. And Joseph's story continues in chapter 39, starting at verse 1, and picking up the text, it says this. Chapter 39, verse 1, "Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian, who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, brought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food that he ate." So we see here a little bit about Potiphar, the master that Joseph was sold to. He was an important official in Pharaoh's court. He was given this title in the NIV translation, the captain of the guard. And the term that was used in the original translation is fairly general, but it indicates he has some sort of military identification going on here. Potiphar's name literally means he whom Re gives. And Re is an Egyptian god, if you do not know. So his title indicates that he is blessed by their Egyptian god. And he will soon find out that he is going to be blessed by the actual true God by having Joseph now in his house. And in verse 2, we see that because God was with Joseph, Joseph prospered in everything that he did. Joseph's faithfulness positioned him in a place where God's blessing could be made known through him, and it brought him a lot of success. And we see here Potiphar and Joseph are being juxtaposed in this situation, aren't they? Potiphar is considered to be blessed by his Egyptian God, but when Joseph comes, he's able to see what it means to be truly blessed by the one true God. Potiphar is so pleased with the blessing that he's receiving from having Joseph in his house that he promotes Joseph. He becomes his most trusted servant, doesn't he? He puts him in charge of everything in his household. And in verse 5, it says, the Lord blessed that household because of Joseph. With Joseph in charge, the whole household of Potiphar is experiencing this amazing blessing from God. And what the author is doing here in this story is he's letting you and I know that Joseph is the one God had promised to bring about a fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant he made so long ago. Because God made in covenant with Abraham generations ago. And he said, through you, I'm going to bless you, but that blessing is going to overflow into all the nations around you, through you and your descendants. And so the author is letting us know that, hey, Joseph, he is now being a blessing to the other nations. Thus, God is starting to bring about the fulfillment of this covenant I made with his ancestors generations ago. And 2 times in this passage, we are told that Joseph's success, it came because God was with him. This portion of Joseph's story, what it's telling you and me today, is that true success isn't earned. It's entrusted by God. There's often this temptation that we have to wrestle with when we think of Joseph's story, because we often equate Joseph's success with his integrity, with his faith, with his diligence, with his righteousness, with his hard work, with his service, as if those were the reasons in which he got the high position in Potiphar's house that he got. But this text clearly states 2 times in the passage that it was because God was with him. That's the reason he was blessed. That's the reason he prospered, because God was with him. The author tells us the true story. Joseph shouldn't get the credit. God should. And we live in a world that often rewards how hard we work, rewards those who hustle, who self-make their own success. But this passage challenges that kind of mindset, doesn't it? Because it's God, not necessarily our grind, that brings about lasting success. And oftentimes, I think we do fall into this temptation to think that we are better than we actually are. Because we want to give ourselves the credit as if we're the ones who put in the hard work, who were determined and had enough drive to bring about all the blessings that we have in our life. But this story reminds us of the sobering truth. We're not as good as we think we are most of the time. It's actually God's power at work in Joseph that brings the blessing, not his abilities. And this story shows us that success, it's not earned, it's given to us by God. And when this is the case, Joseph's success isn't dependent or defined by the position in which he has. He was just as successful when he was in the pit as he is in control of Pharaoh's house. And I believe this text is a call for us to start living a little bit more humble lives, to start giving God credit for the things that we often like to take credit for. I think when we really think about it, we're a little more prideful than we like to let on. And oftentimes what this does, when we think that we've earned these things, we've accomplished these things, we start to hold on to those things that we've acquired, thinking we deserve them, that we earn them, that it's our hard work that brought them. And then what happens when those things are ripped from us? Then we end up frustrated. But when we act like Joseph and recognize that God's blessing, that God is the one who is bringing the blessing into our lives, then we can be just as successful when we are in our lows as we are in our highs. And when I remind you of this, what I'm not saying is that you should neglect working hard. You should neglect having a good work ethic. That's not what I'm saying this morning. Don't let me confuse you. Because you still have a role to play. But even when you play your role, don't think too highly of yourselves. Remember to give God credit. because he is the one that gave you the ability to do everything that you are currently doing. And this is not an excuse for you to now slack off and stop working hard or pursuing righteousness or having a good work ethic, not at all. However, blessings are not reserved for those who are perfect. God extends blessing even to those who are broken but are trying their hardest to remain faithful to God and his plans and purposes for their lives. So if success comes from God, does that mean that he's going to make our lives easy if we choose to follow him? Well, not for Joseph. In fact, it brought on its own set of unique challenges, and let's continue reading and let's see what happens next. The text says this, picking up in the second half of verse 6, "Now Joseph was well built and handsome. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, 'Come to bed with me.' But he refused. 'With me in charge,' he told her, 'my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then can I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?' And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. One day he went into the house to attend his duties, and none of the household servants were inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, 'Come to bed with me.' But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house." This portion of the text, it gives us a deeper look into the type of person Joseph is. First, right off the bat, we see that he is handsome. We see that he is well built. And we see that he's clearly successful in everything that he touches and does. So Joseph, naturally, he had everything going for him. But the success that he didn't make him immune to temptation. It actually made him a target. Because now Potiphar's wife begins to take notice of this servant who is doing really well, who's well built, who's handsome. She starts to see him around the house pretty often. This foreigner is good looking. He's around awesome. It's really impressive to her, and she commands him to sleep with her. And Joseph refuses her request. And he gives her the reasoning because he is loyal to his master. He explains how his master has given him so much and trusted him with everything except her. And then he says, he cannot do such a wicked thing because that would be sinning against my master or against God. He said that would be sinning against my God. You see, Joseph doesn't just refuse, he frames his refusal as both a betrayal of trust, but also sin against God. He's not just avoiding the consequences that could come from his master in his physical life, he is actually displaying a life that is lived with integrity. And so, knowing her desires, he not only just refuses her this once, but does his best to avoid her completely. And then a day comes where he is unable to avoid her, and she catches him by his cloak. It's in her hand, and he sees her, and he bolts out the door, leaving his cloak in her hand. He denies her once again, but this time he is bolting out of the house. And this scene of seduction, it's written in such a way where Joseph is shown in a positive light the entire time, isn't he? The way the details are given, they confirm that Joseph is undeniably innocent. He has done absolutely nothing wrong in this situation. He never led Potiphar's wife on. When he first heard of her desires, he did everything he could to avoid her, and then he got trapped by her and he bolted out the door, not thinking for a second that he would participate in what she is trying to get him to do. This story shows us the strength of Joseph's character, that his loyalty to God and his master outweigh any of the temptations that came his way. And one of the unique things this passage illuminates for us as we are reading it together this morning is that Joseph's success did not eliminate challenges from his life, did it? If anything, his success actually attracted greater temptation to come his way. And sometimes the higher we rise in our success, the harder the tests and the challenges may become for us. And we often think that if we reach the top, if we reach the thing we are striving for, that's when life will finally go well for us. But this story that shows us that even though Joseph made it to the top, the highest rank he could get as a foreigner in Potiphar's house, he was given that high position, but he still had to face challenges and tests. And the challenge he faced was the seduction of Potiphar's wife. And no matter where we find ourselves in life, we are going to be faced with challenges. We're going to be faced with trials. We're going to be faced with temptation. And so the question for us, when we face those seasons of our life, is this: who are we going to choose to be loyal to when those challenges come our way? Who are we going to be loyal to when those tests, those temptations, those trials, they come our way? For Joseph in this story, it would have been much easier for him to just obey the request of his master's wife, wouldn't it have been? He could have just gone through with it. Nobody would have known. She would have done a good job of keeping it a secret. Joseph could have pursued his own interests in that season. He had possession of everything in Potiphar's house except one thing, his wife. And now his wife comes to him and says, "You can have me as well." And he decides, no. I'm not going to assume control. I'm not going to take what's not mine. And oftentimes, when we are in places where we have given success, it's become so easy for us to get into that mindset of we should have it all. But Joseph, he has boundaries and he has limits. And when he is faced with this challenge and this test, he remains full of integrity. In the face of temptation, he remained loyal to his true master and to God's calling. So we can see that success is not necessarily a safety net, is it? Oftentimes it's actually a spotlight, and it reveals our true character that lies underneath. And oftentimes, success will multiply our pressures instead of eliminate them. And so I want you to just kind of think for a moment, has success ever tempted you to cut corners? Maybe to seek comfort over conviction, or become self-reliant rather than God-reliant. Oftentimes, when we're under pressure, we can find ourselves rationalizing, making excuses. But this sexual sin that Joseph was faced with is an act of disobedience against God, not just the people that were involved. And Joseph resisted it because he knew this, and he remained faithful to his true master, who was his God. And we need to also remain loyal to God when we are under pressure and find ourselves in the face of temptation. This requires an incredible amount of faith and resilience. But more importantly, it's about remaining focused on God's desires for our lives more than our own. And as Joseph's status and success grew, he continued to face challenges, but he never loses sight of who his true master is. He remained humble, knowing that God was the reason for his success, and because of that, he was able to maintain his integrity and do the right thing when temptation came his way. Our lives will not be devoid of tests, temptations, and challenges, but who are you going to remain loyal to when they come your way? When Joseph faced temptation of Potiphar's wife, he refused her request, remained God-reliant rather than self-reliant, but he also took the actions that he needed to. He avoided her as much as he could, and when he was trapped by her, he ran from her. Sometimes it may not be enough for us to simply avoid temptations and challenges. Sometimes they might entrap us. And when those situations arrive, we need to actively turn and run from them when they cross our path. And even though Joseph was obedient to turning and running from those temptations that came his way, it doesn't mean that his loyalty would bring him immediate success. It wouldn't bring him immediate rewards. In fact, it ended up costing him greatly. So what do we do when the right thing doesn't seem to pay off for us? Well, let's continue reading. Let's find out, picking back up the text in verse 13. When she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, she called her household servants. "Look," she said to them, "this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him this story: "That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." When his master heard the story his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me," he burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. Joseph's refusal to give in to temptation, it left Potiphar's wife rejected, humiliated. and she chose to retaliate with false accusations about who Joseph is. And in response, she fabricates this whole story to frame Joseph and turn his integrity into an accusation now. And she identifies him as a Hebrew slave who was brought to make sport of her. And she starts saying this to the other servants in the house to get them fired up about the atrocities of what's happening in this house. And then she continues and she brings it straight to Potiphar. And if you noticed, her accusation is actually not against Joseph so much as it is her husband. It's you who brought this slave into my house. And so you can see that Potiphar's response was he burned with anger. And it doesn't say who he burned with anger to. And this is intentional because normally you would think he would burn towards Joseph. But he's burning at the accusation that is now made about him. And he's frustrated with how his wife is choosing to deal with this situation. And he knows Joseph's faithfulness. And he's not immediately jumping to Joseph being the problem in this story, is he? And so what does he choose to do? Because this puts him in a really hard position. He has to deal with his wife's accusations, which are now made public throughout the house. He has to retain his family's honor somehow. But he also knows Joseph's character and he trusts him. And he doesn't want to get rid of his most trusted servant who's bringing this huge blessing upon his home. So Potiphar's put in a sticky situation, isn't he? So how does he choose to handle it? Well, Potiphar took Joseph and put him in prison, a place for the king's prisoners. Well, if Potiphar actually believed his wife's story, if he was actually burning with anger towards Joseph, he had full rights to execute Joseph right then and there, on the spot, no questions asked. But in contrast, he decides to put him in the king's prison, which was a place that was designated for political prisoners. It would never have been expected to accommodate a foreign slave guilty of these kinds of accusations. So, that shows us that Potiphar's actions that he took towards Joseph were as minimal as it could be, but still retains his family's honor. But despite how heroic Potiphar's acts are, we still have a problem with Joseph, don't we? Because now he's in prison. And regardless of whether it's the king's prison or the foreigner's prison, both places are grim and not places you want to be in. They have vile living conditions. And back then, prisoners were not innocent until proven guilty. Rather, they were guilty until proven innocent, which means he had no right to a speedy trial. And oftentimes, these prisoners in these kinds of situations would never actually make it to trial because the trials were held at the whim of the ruler. And so the end result of this incarceration is that it puts Joseph in a place where he will become acquainted with the members of Pharaoh's court. And so we can see that God is starting to use all these situations, even the ones where Joseph is put into a position where he is making accusations of, and God is going to take it, and he's going to redeem it, and he's going to use it for his plans and purposes. And so the hardship that Joseph experienced here of being sent to prison was born out of his integrity from doing the right thing. But in the end, God is putting him on the path where he's going to use him to fulfill his plans and his purposes to accomplish extraordinary things. So Joseph's faithfulness, it cost him in the moment, but it actually positioned him to be used in a future role in Pharaoh's court. And oftentimes for us, I think the truth that we get out of this passage is that faith means that we need to trust that God's plan is better, even when our obedience may cost us in the short term. Faith is trusting that God's plan is better. You see, Joseph, he lost everything by staying faithful to God. And are you willing to trust God even when it costs you? Because our culture often tells us that we should chase quick success, whether it's in relationships, finances, personal goals. But like Joseph, faithfulness may mean saying no to the shortcuts, those immediate promises of benefits, because they might actually lead us away from God's better plan that he has for us. And if we don't get the reward that we think we should get, oftentimes we give up on God. We blame God. We say it's his fault that we're not getting what we should deserve. But Joseph, even though he found himself in a prison, he's going to continue to hold on and trust God through this season of his life as well. So how do we have a faith like Joseph's? Well, I believe there's a couple avenues that we can focus on that will build us up to have the strength and the resilience that Joseph had in this situation. And I believe first and foremost, we need to be people of prayer. We need to pray for strength, especially in the seasons when we are facing great temptation and great challenges. But if we continue to pour into our prayer life and lean on God for our help and for our strength, that will bolster us up so when those seasons of challenge and difficulty and temptation come our way, we will be able to handle it like Joseph did. And I think another clear application for us too is to anchor ourselves in Scripture so that we can recognize false promises that the world tries to offer us. Because this book is full of God's promises where He wants to bless our lives. And when we are faithful to Him, He will make our path straight. It continually reminds us that even though we're walking through difficulty, God can redeem it for good. These are the promises we need to hold on to, not the promises that the world has to offer us. When it tells us you can get rich quick, or if you were able to just find a way to get after those who have wronged you, you will feel better about yourself. If you jump into those things that make you feel good, you'll experience happiness. Those are the lies of the world. That's the deceit that tries to enter into our hearts. But the Bible is full of those promises of holding on to God, even in those seasons where you don't understand what is happening. So we need to anchor ourselves in Scripture, remember His promises so that we can pull them out when we're in seasons of challenge and seasons of difficulty. And then lastly, we need to stay rooted in community. Because I believe when we are in isolation, it makes temptation so much harder for us to resist. We come together on Sunday mornings for a reason, to be together, to fellowship, to be in community, to bolster each other up, to encourage each other, to be there for each other when we are facing challenges, we're facing trials, facing temptations. And so if you don't have that community in your life and you're going about it isolated, you will face attacks, and it's going to be much harder to resist when you are going it alone rather than with your community of faith. So I encourage you, invest in this faith community, and it will help you be so much stronger when temptations and challenges come your way. But Joseph's decision to stay faithful, it cost him his high position. It cost him his personal happiness that I'm sure he was experiencing. And what looked like a prison sentence was actually God's setup for something so much greater that was going to take place. So what if in our lives, the hardship that we face is preparing us for something great that God has in store for us? Are we willing to trust Him as He starts to write our story, even when obedience is costly? His temptation often promises us quick rewards, but nothing compares to what God gives to those who are faithful to Him. Faithfulness to God will not always lead to success. We see that in Joseph's story. He was faithful, but it led to suffering. It led to difficulty. And we see that in Joseph's imprisonment. But God isn't done yet. And His plan has something so much greater in store for Joseph's life. So the world that often tells us we should be true to ourselves, we should follow our hearts no matter what. Our culture is constantly bombarding us with this, if it feels good, do it mentality. Every message is pointing to this, reinforcing this idea that personal happiness is our ultimate goal. But Joseph gives us a glimpse into what faithfulness without compromise looks like. But Jesus, He actually lived it out radically. You see, Jesus, He set the example of what faithfulness to God truly looks like. He lived a life of perfect obedience to His Father. He endured injustice. He endured suffering. He even endured death at the hands of men. Yet through His obedience and His sacrificial death on the cross, He accomplished the greater work, the greatest work that could ever be done. He restored the broken relationship between God and humanity, and because of Jesus, anyone who calls on His name will be saved. It's through His sacrificial death that our mistakes and our failures no longer separate us from God. And we can experience forgiveness and reconciliation with Him. So while Joseph's story gives us a great example of faithfulness, none of us can live up to that standard perfectly on our own. But thanks to Jesus, we can be assured that even when we fall short, God will never leave us and he will never forsake us. And because of Jesus' great work that he accomplished, we are granted success. It's not by anything we achieved on our own, but through the ultimate sacrifice that he made on the cross. And in that, we find strength to remain faithful even in the midst of life's greatest challenges. So at the beginning, we talked about a key question that we're trying to answer today. How do we remain faithful to God rather than ourselves in the midst of life's greatest challenges? And what we saw through Joseph is that in the midst of life's big challenges, we can remain faithful to God by relying on his strength rather than our own, by standing firm with integrity in the face of temptation and trusting that his reward far exceeds anything that we could accomplish on our own. The world will tell you to follow your own desires, but God is calling you to follow him despite how hard the road might be. And in the end, it's his faithfulness that is going to carry you through.